So Christina sent you a boatload of links and stuff.
I've not had the proper time to go through them all. I appreciate so much all of your expertise, all of you, and Helen having done a lot of this work for DHS, and all these resources have been very helpful.
Yeah. Do you want me to run through some of those to explain what each document is, or
Um,
when
maybe
something comes?
briefly while we wait
Huh?
for folks to come. Maybe briefly while we wait for maybe a few more folks to join.
Sure. The ones marked job descriptions, which everybody got because everybody was in the same email, are the result of at least 6 months to a year of intense work during the pandemic with subject matter experts from across the world of what interpreters really do. And that should help you to develop a job description that's appropriate for interpreters and translators. I mean, these are people from IEC and from NAJIT and from certified federal court interpreters, and they're like, wait, I wish I'd seen this when I got my master's. So we're hoping it's useful to you, and you know,
Yes.
that's my grandson Johnny hiding behind me, trying to be invisible. I'm failing miserably. So, but that's one of the key things that's there. The stuff from the Department of Homeland Security was something where I got a phone call on Labor Day weekend. Hey, Helen, can you help us put this together? And it was quick, but it was also verified by experts in the interpreters division. And we pulled a lot of that material out of Savvy Newcomer. So it had been previously vetted. It's not something we made up. And so it built on stuff that was there already and that I had the rights to. So we could quickly pull it off. And when we had to consult with somebody, we asked them. Uh, I do not have expertise in ASL, but when I've heard ASL interpreters present on their needs, they are exactly the same needs we spoken language interpreters have. Team interpreting, uh, seeing the materials ahead of time, line of sight, ability to hear. You'll hear that from ASL, and they'll say, "Yeah, we ASL interpreters need yada yada yada." Do well, no, all interpreters need that. Okay, so that's where a lot of things fail when we don't even know the subject of. I mean, in general terms, the subject of the interview. Like, is it going to be about cars? Are they going to be discussing yellow jackets? You know, are they going to be discussing farm equipment? I mean, I don't need to know the brand, but I'd like to be able to look at a picture of a tractor before I get there. So I don't drive tractors. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes,
It's going to be
definitely.
medical. Well, what part of the body are we talking about? The toe is not the same as the brain. So, I mean, you don't really have to disclose personal information. This doesn't identify anybody. But that information would really be helpful if we want to provide quality services. And there's some of the kind of things that we never get. So I'm assuming Com and Puma, they're nodding their heads a lot, saying, "Yeah, we too." And the other thing is, interpreters are not going to accept a job for less money than they're already getting somewhere else. So if somebody is working and even as in the field, and they have to leave that job for the whole day so that they can go and do an interpreting appointment for you, they're not going to do it unless they're paid for that plus the daycare and the travel it's going to cost them. Because we don't do this to go broke. And so that's, and I've heard from, I've been in touch with Alilia a lot from Cielo, and last name's escaping me. Cam probably knows her. But she's told me, these that they don't get paid. They get asked to lower their rates, but they also eventually don't even get paid in the first place. So that is a problem, and we don't work for free. So though that's not on our agenda, it is a factor that limits the availability of interpreters. And I can't help discussing that. It's just, um, so. So anyway, that's just some of the stuff I've got. But I
Perfect. No,
wanted you
thank
to
you.
see some of that. And
Thank you very much. That's going to be helpful because obviously I'm just trying to lay there's just like some general groundwork and
yeah,
structure, but obviously this is not my expertise to write all of these things. So let me share, I'll share my screen just to show that document that I sent around, which is very rough, but please be nice to me if I if you disagree with things that I put in here, I am fine with that. So I kind of see um these are very basic. I know that Helen, I saw you just sent, a very long description of what a translator does, right? And so it's not my goal to be an all-encompassing thing, but I do want to differentiate between these roles because I think they are
yeah.
smushed together very often. So what is an interpreter versus a translator? So those aren't used interchangeably. And then what are the rules for bilingual staff like Esmeralda in terms of, yes, you have a role to play, but, that's also a separate role than interpreter. And so these are meant to be basic and hear about if anybody had any thoughts or things you thought that I was missing, especially maybe the role of bilingual staff. I was looking around in a lot of different places on how this was defined in different places. And so
Well,
I
I
like the
just
idea of simple communications that are low risk, but I would love your all's thoughts.
one of the things I don't see there is any information about how they are qualified as bilingual staff. Johns Hopkins Hospital is, I remember going there on a tour of their medical interpreting facility. Johnny, get away from that. Johnny, get away. And so what I remember seeing there is that they uh, language tested every single person who was gonna speak in a language other than English, even if it was a Venezuelan doctor from Venezuela who got his degree in Venezuela and he just got off the plane. That guy still got through the test of can you really speak Spanish? So uh, because if they left anybody out, it was, and this is just, and it was not a list of did you have this degree or that degree. It's a language proficiency test because people learn languages in many different ways through many different paths. Uh, um, uh, um, it was an oral proficiency test, and the thing is that it doesn't really matter how you learned it. What matters is that you know the language. So even for monolingual work, when they're communicating monolingually with a patient, there's articles in the medical field where this has been researched that say that doctors who communicate, who don't really have the language proficiency but pretend they do, uh, end up having really bad problems with the patients. And we've definitely seen our fair share of that kind of thing happening in our field.
So I
So
think
verifying the language proficiency of people, and I would say it should be at the ACTFL Advanced High at a minimum, because the National Board and CCHI ask for an advanced mid before people take the test. So they have a vetting system beyond that. So if it was advanced high, then it's a little bit higher than you have to do when you have a safety system, a safety valve behind it to pass the test. I don't know what Mel thinks on that, but I think that's very important.
and so I think yeah, I think that's a dimension I hadn't thought about the certification of bilingual staff. I guess I was putting it here to differentiate it from interpreters to say that, bilingual staff are not interpreters, right? So they might have a role. Right now, it is not necessarily a funded specified position. but many offices that are in parts of the state that have high Spanish speaking populations, for instance, look for bilingual staff because they want that assistance. And so I was just trying to differentiate between what their role might be if you have that and sort of, but I think that's a good point. And I think there is
Well,
a future, an ability to create a qualification, obviously for that and for a higher pay and things like that if you have certain qualifications or
exactly.
proficiencies.
In the federal government, they have ILR levels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so if they have they give them a percentage raise based on their ILR score, and expect them to use the language. But honestly, every bilingual person I know, or 95% of them at least, actually does interpreting and translation on the job. There is no exception. I mean, oh, Spanish. Here's a Spanish speaker. Boom.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up doing less of their 9 to 5 job because they're interpreting so much, and then they might get fired for not doing all of their 9 to 5 job. But this happens. It's a reality. And Mel has her hand up, so I'm going to shut up.
No, it's good. When I was with OJD, we actually did a bilingual staff training and did a big, what we call a blitz, where I went around the state and talked about this because Helen is right. But the caution is you want to recognize somebody who's bilingual and encourage entities to hire bilingual staff to talk directly to consumers, people that they're there to work with in their native language. Like that is the skill set, but it's within the job that they were hired to do. They're providing a service in 2 languages. That call to get interpreted is where the hesitancy, especially in the judicial department, because then we're saying this person has the interpreting skill, and that's not what's happening. Like that's not what we wanted to push forward. We wanted to have a real clear delineation of a bilingual staff who's performing their duty in their native language or a language other than English, as compared to somebody who's doing interpreting and translation on the side, and how those are 2 separate tasks that are being completed in the workplace. Helen's also right. Of course, there has to be the supervisor acknowledgement that they're leaving their desk duty and their regular paid jobs to be called to do another task. And when that starts happening, that's when we want to caution and say, actually, do we need to have an interpreter? Because somebody might be trained in, like, I'm thinking of like traffic court, right? Like they're taking in the ticket or taking payment, the cashier stuff. That doesn't mean they have the vocabulary to interpret traffic court. Those are really 2 separate tasks that we're wanting to address, and just having that caution of applauding, giving a pay differential for bilingualism, and then knowing what that role really means. Doesn't mean that you're now an interpreter. An interpreter has a high level of training, a high level of standards, and it is and so forth. I'll stop talking now. But
Thank you. No, that's helpful. And I think that moving forward, we can look to how do we create job. Yeah, and I'm sure we can look to OJD and DAS and how they've already created bilingual overlays to jobs as a basis. We can start there. But how do we create that and make sure, like you said, it's within their job description and not you're just pulled whenever a Spanish speaker calls any part of your office to go and run, and assist.
So on what Mel was saying about people getting pulled from their desks, that's true. So what I developed for my students and I recommend they use is a bit of a spreadsheet that says from 8:15 to 8:45, I was pulled to my desk to interpret for somebody. During that time, Janie covered my phone reception stuff so I could keep doing that other thing that I was needed for. And so like time, start time, end time, what on earth you were pulled from, and how your job got covered during that time is useful, because then when people start complaining about the effect on others of this, because they inevitably have to cover for you, you have data to show, and then that can show whether you need another person to be hired as to provide this language access service that you are providing de facto. So
Yeah. Okay. Great. No, and so I've tried to put a note here on the side to kind of memorialize what you were speaking about as this
yeah.
develops. If that makes sense, we can continue down that pathway. I want to take advantage of the folks that we have here, especially Puma and Tam, and especially and all of your input together on this very tenuous non-certified minimum qualification point, which I think is going to be the point of highest discussion. I don't know, the grayest area. I think I've pulled together, but above this, different levels of certification that we can also discuss that could qualify as, in place of just OJD certified. You might also be certified in another state court, or certified or professionally qualified in federal court could also count as that level. And then talking about ways to acknowledge the lack of certification and registration tests for certain languages, or
Can you go
and
up
how
a bit
to,
in the page?
yes,
Sorry for
there you go.
interpreting. For just keep going up. There was something. Yeah, there. Attorney obligations, payment tiers.
I was adding that as you talked. Yeah.
What I'm thinking here is, if it'd be great if the people who hire us can be the ones to pay us, so there's less messy paperwork, and then you reimburse them for the, they give you the receipt and you reimburse them for the money they paid us. Because I know that's done for some other contractors, and it'd be a lot simpler, and you'd get to yes a lot faster with interpreters.
Yeah, I think there's limits there in terms of different office structures if you're a solo attorney with a private practice versus if you're within a nonprofit, and the flexibility of like having funds available. But I know there is a mix, I think, of, I don't want to speak out of turn. I understand what you're saying, seeking attorney reimbursement rather than having you all have to bill directly to a PDC. I understand what you're saying. And so these are just notes I was making for myself as you spoke, because as I wanted to draw attention to Laura's ethical obligations to also ensure, their role and making sure an interpreter is meeting their clients' needs. I wanted to make sure that I was drawing out other obligations while we were talking. So I think this registered and minimum levels are really where I'd like to focus the most. We've had conversations around maybe what is the minimum. We have ideals, right? In a perfect world, we'd have tests for everything, and everyone would be able to go through and be certified, and we'd have that, and that's obviously the preferred. And all of our policies and say, if available, have folks that have these certifications. But otherwise, what is the minimum certifications going to look like? And I think last time it was sort of thrown out, language assessments of some kind, training and orientation, and interpretation ethics were sort of three big things that were thrown out. I know that Cam raised the problem, though, or the barrier that there aren't assessments necessarily for a lot of target languages a lot of language period, but a lot of the ones that the collective work with. So I'm wondering if we can talk through a bit more in y'all's experience what you recommend, what suggestions you can do if we just have an individual applying to be an interpreter in a language for which we do not have target language assessment abilities.
What do you want to share? I defer to you on sharing our process with the collective.
ATA certifies translators, not interpreters. So yeah, you're right on that. But that unfortunately is a problem that there was on the ATA database. When you looked for an interpreter and you said certified, it only pulled up ATA certified translators. Now the ATA database has been fixed so that you can say, I want translators or I want interpreter, and then under interpreter ask what certification are you looking for. So that has been cleaned up in the last few years. So I just want to point that out. I'm very involved in ATA, so that's, and they
I
have
was-
what they call credentialed interpreters. Anybody who's on the credentialed interpreter list at ATA has fulfilled the requirements we're talking about here.
Trying to see.
Especially
ATA
the
is
credentialed
another.
interpreters judicial. So credentialed interpreter legal, definitely. The credentialed interpreters medical, maybe not so much.
So potentially ATA accredited legal
No, they're
certification.
credentialed legal, not
Credentialed.
accredited, because ATA
Credentialed,
does
thank
not
you.
accredit them. ATA
Okay.
recognizes the credentials they have from other places. And it's possible that they have lost that credential since they put it on the ATA website. So it's always good to verify. Are
Okay.
they current?
Okay.
Because ATA does not police that.
Yes, this comment, I was looking through Spanish interpreters that are non-certified, and she was trying to figure out what is on their CVs to figure out for discussion. So I found one that was pointing to that was the certification they had outside of experience. So as an example. Okay. I'm sorry. So Puma, I'm sorry, you were going to try to help talk us through how you can qualify or assess interpreters for languages for which there aren't exams or certification or standard exams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think this topic it's been around for many years with the interpreters who speak indigenous language, especially from Central America or Mexico, right? And how we can qualify them. And for us to be qualified, it's kind of I don't know, trying to find the right word to say it, but I can say it disrespectful, right? Because we grown up in our hometown, and speaking our native language in our home with our parents, family, schools, and we have knowledge about our language, period, right? And when we start hearing this conversation, when we have to prove our language proficiency, it's kind of it's offensive or disrespectful, right, for us. But we know and we acknowledge that here the requirements, it has to be that, right, written on papers. So for us, in at least in our collective, one thing that we or I do to attest that they fluent or they qualify in their native language. First of all, it's their background, right, where they learn their languages, right, and that's the one thing. The other thing, I know our interpreters, it's mostly independent contractors, and they've been doing interpretation for several times, right? So they have experience there. That's how I prove that. They have experience and they know their languages from their back home, right? And also with the collective that we have, we know that we lead training with them for talking about community interpretations, so where we touch topics like legal stuff, medical stuff, and ethics, protocols, and confidentiality, and all of those important topics that we know. But and we doing some workshops with them, like just inviting any folk, right, from a legal perspective or medical field, and provide them some workshops in order to them to get familiar to the language. Maybe not 100%, but at least we do our efforts to have those workshops for them. What else? I think that's what I have in mind right now.
So, Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going back to what I wrote up for the DHS on how they could hire an interpreter. But one of the things that we're talking about in language proficiency is the ability to speak their language. And honestly, the students I had who were native speakers of the language always passed those exams with flying colors. I'm going to put a link in the chat just so you can have it and maybe pull it up if you want. Let me see here. This is the ILR description of language proficiency. Okay, and what you're going to see there is, let me just look at it for a second. It says what you can do with the language. So there is also, if you go, let me see, there's in the ILR, you can also find a way to evaluate this and say, okay, I want somebody who's a level 2 because they're able to communicate straightforwardly and so on. So you just ask somebody to have a conversation with them, or just ask somebody who knows them to tell you if they can do these things. That would probably would not be a full-fledged language proficiency test in the sense of a fully fledged exam with vetted results and all that stuff, but it would give you an honest first cut on this, and it might be less offensive to the indigenous speaking people than something else. What do you guys think, Puma and forget your name, Puma and Cam?
Oh,
Just
yeah.
something like this. Would that help you to say this person is able to do this and that in the language? Looking at this, I think they speak at this level.
So, well, it looks like, so I'm trying to share the screen so we can look at the same time. So with different levels, you're able to communicate about these things.
I mean, I don't think the OJD follows this kind of thing, but Mel could speak to that a little bit better. But this is the difference between this and the ACTFL is that the ACTFL is a school-based analysis. Like, can they use the subjunctive? And we really don't care about that. We care what they can do with the language. And it doesn't say, they can use this tense or that tense. It says they can communicate with Johnny. Does that make sense?
So I can share in our ongoing project to actually create these proficiency assessments for Indigenous languages. We are comparing the ACTFL and ILR models to determine one that might be most appropriate. I think there's the principle that can be concerning in that these outside institutions are questioning the linguistic and cultural knowledge of interpreters who are original to these communities. And the question of who is how do you evaluate the evaluator or rate the rater? Who from OJD can say that Puma speaks Quiche or not with sufficient fluency? And so there's those principal concerns. And as Puma alluded to, we also understand there are practical reasons in this country where these tests are needed. And so these are some of the models that we're considering for implementation, but it's a 2-year project pilot. And so we're a long way off from being able to make this available. Certainly not for all the languages for which it's needed.
Cam, have you seen the self-assessment from the ILR? I think it's the third link I put in the chat. I put 3 different links in there. It's just one is for interpreting proficiency, and the other one is for self-assessment, just so you have the whole thing. But
I
unfortunately, they
appreciate
don't.
that. I haven't seen this one. It does mirror in some ways the actual model that we've seen in terms of going up in levels and the way to
Yeah.
assess those levels in real time. And so those are some of the things, but we're also in conversation with contacts in Guatemala at the Academy of Mayan Languages, and are traveling to those communities to seek their input as well. And so we haven't yet decided. We want to go with ILR. We want to go with ACTFL because we want to consult with those communities first before making a decision. I think. Thanks for sharing that, though.
You're welcome. Based on that, we tried to do a Me Too thing in the OHA, writing up some questions that would reflect that kind of stuff so the interviewer could use those questions, then record them. And so the interview is not really assessing, but he's just recording it. And then somebody who speaks the language well, who you get to determine who that is, gets to say, yes, this is well spoken, Quiche, or whatever it is. So there'd be an element of having a person who's not well known by the speaker who can listen to it and say, yeah, that cuts mustard or not. So I could share that with you later. I don't think it went very far in the OHA process because it was a bit more involved. But I do have the database on my computer somewhere. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show you a little bit of. And also the interpreting performance one, if you look at it, which is the second link, will give you information on what you can expect of interpreters at different levels. And this again is the combination of speaking both languages. If you don't speak both languages, forget it. But what should you expect of an interpreter at each level? So this should help you a bit. They typically consider that an ILR level 3 is professional, but it gives you an idea what your expectations should be.
Thanks for sharing those. That's helpful. One reason we are having to slow walk this process is to ensure both the validity of the model and the reliability of the rating system.
Of course.
And we're wanting to make sure that, and there's several different communities and linguistic groups we're trying to consult with. And so remains to be seen what our official timeline looks like. We're hoping to have at least one assessment available by the end of the year.
Wow.
But we're starting with a model first that hopefully we could apply to multiple languages, but there's a lot of consultation that still needs to happen. And we don't know yet where these partners like ILR or ACTFL would stand, what type of collaboration or ownership that they would assert. So there's still a lot of question marks.
I know one of the people who developed a lot of these ILR standards. She's like in her late 80s, but she loves to help people with this stuff. So email me if you want to get put in touch with her. The other thing is, Joe, I forget the name of the guy from New Jersey who wrote, basically helped develop the interpreting court certification exam. Melanie might remember his name. No? Well, he's on the advocacy committee in Nagit, so I could pull his name up fast and get it to you. He loves to help people with this kind of thing. So, I mean, right now he's retired and this is what he loves to do. So you would not be imposing by talking to either one of these two people. I could just send a quick introduction email copying you, and I'll put my email in the chat in case you need it for that. But just these are resources that you can use that will be available for you. Just let me know.
Thanks, Helen. We'll take you up on that.
So I'm wondering, while we wait for this wonderful work to progress, some thought that I had in trying to balance the barriers that folks that are like in your collective have to getting on the registered and certified list and all of these things. I put maybe as a stand-in for being registered, being employed by an approved language service provider, which I know is a loaded term. because we have on the other end of the spectrum language service providers that maybe aren't doing well, that are different. There's a range of these providers. But what I'm thinking about is for languages for which there are no exams, for which there aren't certifications available, rather than try to have our agency or somebody else weigh qualifications and things like that. If we have groups and we lay out what are our expectations or hopes for these organizations, and I put in a note to the side here where there are not certification exams, organizations, these are just what you just said, Puma, organizations that are able to evaluate fluency, provide trainings and CLEs on interpretation or various fields. And like if there's organizations like the Collective that are equipped to assess things like fluency and things like that, and give that foundational thing, and so we can say, yes, we think this organization has a good vetting process for their interpreters, for which there is not other like outside certification exams available. So then we say, okay, if you have, for instance, the collectives, if you're part of the collective, then we know you are at this level, and so we could do that. And to counterbalance, to make sure that it doesn't open it up too much, that's why I put the limiting where there are no exams.
One of the things that I remember hearing, and Mel will be familiar with this issue, is that, language companies that didn't know anything about ASL were sending ASL people to places, and it was a complete disaster. So we learned through the School of Hard Knocks that to get an ASL interpreter, you should work with an ASL provider. And I think the same thing applies to Indigenous languages, because there's a huge complexity there, and organizations that are led by Indigenous people should be the ones to be vetting Indigenous speakers for interpreting in courts, because I can't say that strongly enough. Just the same procedure that we follow with ASL should be followed with Indigenous languages. Because we already saw what happens when you don't. No need to repeat the experiment.
Yeah. This is Mel. I will just share too. I have a couple of thoughts, and I want to be respectful and thoughtful. We do have a code of professional conduct, and we have the department we do based on lawsuits and such, right? So I wish all interpreters came from a place of goodwill and best intentions. And we have had interpreters do identity theft. We have had interpreters not have boundaries and cause harm. And because of that, these are actual stories that we know and we're part of things that happen. So it's not so long ago. We're talking the last 20 years, right? And as the field of profession becomes more visible, more people are drawn to our profession as well. And we have to have some type of minimal screening so that we protect the individuals that we're serving. And again, I hate to bring up that other side of the coin, but having had to be the one who works with these people and kind of work through those processes, it would be negligent if I didn't at least comment on them, right? So I do bring that up. And then in that same vein, agencies that we might contract with make money off of the backs of interpreters. And so they're going to fill jobs and put a warm body there without necessarily the testing or the vetting. But so when I just did a big RFP for Portland Community College, one of my requirements was you're paying a living wage to your interpreters, that you treat your interpreters. I want to know who I'm giving our money to. Like, I'm not going to hire any agency out there that is not pushing the field forward and is not supporting their interpreters the best that I feel they should. And granted, I have privilege to do so as somebody who signs contracts, but just as you think through and as you go out and you're looking, take into account the field that you are playing on, right? Like, there are people that are paying interpreters $18, $15 for 1 hour of work And that person has to leave their job, leave their family, get in a car, and spend 3 hours to serve because they have a heart of service. And we're taking advantage. So I put that all in there because it gets pulled from so many sides when we're looking at this field. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Helen and Mel as well. I think those are the main issues that we've been facing as Indigenous interpreters, right? Not just Indigenous interpreters, because there's also, I know some folks that they interpret from Spanish and other languages that they face the same issues as well, right? But I'm speaking about now from my perspective as an Indigenous interpreter, that it's those points that you just share, it's the main issues that we've been seeing for a long time, right? So it's time for, as Helen said, that give us this opportunity, right, and do this work, right, and as a member of the community, as a person who know the language, and as a person that has those knowledge, right, and but as well, we don't want to do things like the other corporations, right? I've been trying to be recruited from different entities, right, providing interpretations, but I don't want it, because I know what I want for the Indigenous interpreters, and they don't acknowledge my rates, you know. And sometimes I hear from them like, we're gonna give you trainings and blah 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 blah, yada yada, and in reality they don't, right? So it's, but the ironic thing here, it's the court settings or medical settings, they still hire them as a provider, right, without ensuring the quality from the interpreters, right? So we know that, and that's why we trying to do this work, like the project Cam just mentioned before, and we want to have and ensure the real, excuse my the word real, the what's the word, Cam?
Reliability.
Yes, thank you. And from the people who will test the interpreters, right? So we want to work with the folks that they actually have those knowledge in their native languages.
Yeah, I feel like that was kind of the, how would we vet the vetting groups also, right? That's the next step, right? It's like, well, it's not in our wheelhouse, right, to say, yes, you can speak this language, yes or no, based on your resume, right? So we might say, okay, the collective has all these reasons why we think you are very qualified to assess someone's fluency in another, like, Indigenous language, at least to tell us, right? But how do we ward against, like we're talking about, more exploitive agencies, or ones that aren't doing the screening? So then what do we look for in who's going to get on this imaginary OPDC approved list of agencies that we have vetted to vet certain languages for which there are no exams, right? So this gets very, all these levels. But that's what I was trying to get at is, can we, if we have guarantees, or that everybody that came through that is a part of your group had to meet certain requirements, right? Or
Gotta go. Bye.
bye. Thank you so much, Helen, for your time.
Welcome.
I think verifying the fair pay living wage is easy, or it should be. If the agency's not willing to show you their contract and tell you what they pay the interpreters and what they receive, that's a red flag in my book. And the other part, vetting the vetter, it's much more challenging. And I mean, that's why we are trying to do the project that we're working on, We're still deciding on the criteria for who is the linguistic expert, what kind of background they need. Maybe they're working professionally or academically in their original language. Maybe that's one piece of a qualification. There's a whole host of, so it's a big issue, and I think that's a longer term solution. We have an interim or a need for an interim solution too, right? I know when we were trying to get OHA to reconsider some of their requirements and processes, their route was to just accept a letter of recommendation from an individual or an organization, which is better than excluding somebody wholly, but they have no way of assessing the veracity of that reference as well. I don't know a short-term solution.
Right.
I would agree. Like the work I've been doing with deaf interpreters, I think this is a very similar vein. For people who don't know, 98% of ASL interpreters are born to hearing parents. So I learned sign language as a college class in a very academic setting. It is not native to me. It is not I'm not bilingual. Like I wasn't raised knowing sign language. So my limitation in my second language is a lot because and we don't have a deaf land to go to immerse in sign language, right? So we use relay interpreters, and very similar to indigenous languages working in relay with a Spanish interpreter. Anyway, we're also going through licensure at the state, and to cast a wide net, like to sit with this, to do no harm and to protect the needs of people means to invite people in at the expense, you know what I mean? Like if you create a process so stringent, it weeds so many people out, you're causing harm over here. And do you do that on the chance that you're going to exclude, so I think that letter of recommendation is kind of where I settle to, but also the training and then getting that certificate. Like, I mean, that is a door. Like, did the person show up? Did they participate? And are you guys going to pay for the interpreters for them to go to this training, right? Like when you create a program and a budget, you have to put in a line item for interpreting and translation of your materials. Like, just how are you going to support these people through your pipeline and be more, I think you need to wait in and then have a complaint process so that if something does go south, you get a ding. Like the attorney can be like, they showed up driving together. I don't know. They didn't answer any of the questions and the interpreter never interpreted, or something, you know what I mean? Like there has to be a feedback loop. If we're going to cast a wide net to include everybody in, then our safety measure is that complaint process. And the complaint process is not punitive. It's you need more training. Let me give you resources on more training that's out there. It seems like you need to go take another ethics class or take some more language neutral training, go back to your agency. We don't want to punish people. We want to build them up because we need the resources. So what does that inclusive practice look like?
Yeah.
I mean, a really simple example, just to pick up on Mel's point. I mean, in the OHA case, no trainings, none of the required medical healthcare interpreter trainings are offered in Spanish, period. And we have applied to lead them for them. And you'd think we were dealing with the USSR's bureaucracy to get them to approve a curriculum or to collaborate with us. I mean, it's pretty simple and obvious, if I recall correctly, I believe OJD is a little bit, if I can speak frankly, ahead of the curve relative to OHA in terms of providing some of their trainings and opportunities for interpreters that are required in languages other than English, I think primarily Spanish. But I don't know that that's uniform across all of the required court observation and trainings, mentorship, continuing education, etc. That's a pretty low hanging fruit.
Yeah. Would it be in it before that is available? Would providing like a Spanish interpreter to accompany someone to a training, is that okay, like comparable in the short term, or is that just
I think you have enough Spanish speaker trainers out there.
Yeah.
Like, right? Like Helen, this group, OJD staff interpreters who are Spanish interpreters. They're the ones that teach the ethics and the training, you know.
no, I'm just
Back
thinking
to
like
that
short
bilingual
term.
staff thing.
Short term, if there's individuals who speak English, but they speak like Spanish and another language, and there's some training that's not accessible to them, hasn't been developed in Spanish in the short term to help get more folks through certain types of trainings, could like a Spanish interpreter be provided to go to an English training and still be effective? I guess is my question I posit to you guys. Or is
I
that
mean,
just too far removed, like too hectic?
as a working interpreter, I would want to review the training ahead of time. I'd want all the vocabulary ahead of time. And if you're going to use it over and over again, you're going to want to make a durable training that is accessible moving forward. So you could spend the money up front, do it right, and then have it available for the life of the training. You could do it recorded, and then that's serving people that work in rural areas, right? And then you have it captioned in Spanish and a voiceover. And you could choose your captioning. And there's contracts in place already through PCC. There are statewide contracts. They're open to anybody where you can go out and send that training and say, I want this captioned in these languages, and I want it a voiceover interpreted in these languages, and they put the tracks right over it. So it's just getting the money to do it, you know, but it's been paying an interpreter once a month for ever. You know?
For a 60-hour curriculum or so much,
true.
that turns into 80 hours because of the interpretation that's required. And if there's participatory activities, how do you facilitate those if the facilitator's only doing so in English? I think it just breaks down as opposed to the easier route of actually tailoring it to the linguistic community that you're working with. The training that we offer is specifically designed for Indigenous interpreters, the foundational training curriculum. And that's what we had hoped to do on the medical side as well. Comparable training is needed for Indigenous interpreters. But again, if the state with all its might decides to take the initiative and do that instead of rely on a 7.5 person nonprofit, they might get it done in a shorter period of time.
Okay, so it sounds like, back to what we have going on here so far. It sounds like the employed by a vetted language service provider is doable, but we need to put in the guardrails to be able to ensure there's certain protections in place and standards in place for one of those groups. And so barring that, we have this minimum, like what is the minimum, right? And I know this is where we originally got the pushback from about, sometimes there isn't language assessment, but these are sort of the three pieces that came up last time, like some kind of language assessment, some kind of training or orientation on interpretation, and knowledge of ethics. And so,
Christine, I'm sorry, it's late in the day, so the ADD meds have worn off.
I hear that.
OJD has an Indigenous training for court interpreters already made. It's canned. It was created by our master level Spanish interpreters. And of course, we recognize the need to have access to quality interpreters that have gone through the training. So like the language neutral training orientation is might already be created.
Great. Well, that makes it easier to implement as a standard.
And then the ethics training as well. But again, I don't know if they're still offering the Indigenous trainings anymore. I haven't been there for 5 years. But I mean, maybe if the collective approached OJD and said, hey, we now have people that we have vetted. Our biggest problem was always getting the word out. And we always went through like a law program for Indigenous farm workers and trying to find people that were farm workers that wanted to come in. So, I mean, like maybe already people that are working interpreters would be the natural relationship to cultivate. But I mean, I think they knew that there was an interest and there were people already identified that would be willing to attend, that would be an easy sell.
Mel, I believe I'm correct here. That training you referenced was created in collaboration with Natividad Medical Foundation by
I
the
think so.
individual Catherine Allen, who is
Yeah.
a consultant that we have since hired to create our foundational training curriculum based off of that one. It's been updated once, and we're working on a second revision now. So we have that. That's ours. What's missing is probably legal terminology and some other supplemental things I'm sure OJD would want to see. Yeah.
I think inviting one of their staff interpreters I mean, their staff interpreters are always looking for a project. So, you know.
Well, I mean, you know, what would be nice, and I think we'll have to end up doing probably is lobbying at the state to get the state to recognize this is a service to the state, and the state ought to pay for the consultant fees for Puma's time to create and update and facilitate, to make sure it's free for folks to enroll in the program, to put it on LMS so it's accessible to folks who can't come in person. That's all, you know, we're deferring that with private fundraising right now, but it's really the state's obligation.
Yeah. I wonder about OJD having the money for that. I think they do. You know what I mean? Like they would be the ones that would foot the bill because you grow them on your side, but they show up in court. And they have an online management system that they're utilizing now. So I think Michelle Gearhart would be the one to reach out to for sure. Yes.
That I mean, the vast majority of interpretation needs are like Spanish and also indigenous, like Mayan, those sorts of languages. I think are a huge bulk, but especially at the end of the ones that come up for non-certified requests are a lot of indigenous languages. But we have to be mindful, I think, also of other languages that are not common. I know a friend of mine is about to have a trial in Mai, which is relate. I don't want to say related to, but like Somali. So he was saying how a lot of Somali interpreters also speak Mai, but not all. And he was talking me through how his witnesses are all this combination of folks that speak Somali or Mai, sometimes both, sometimes not, and trying to gear up for a trial that he's coming up on a very serious case. And so languages like Mai, Burmese, Chuukese comes up a lot in Oregon. A community I did not have as much awareness of before I moved to Oregon. And so ways to create trainings or what have you, or what requirements, if any, for minimum certification to make sure you are aware of what is the role of an interpreter, right? Which is purely interpret. You don't editorialize or convert, those sorts of things, which as an attorney with some of these languages, sometimes we have interpreters roll up and really get in the middle of your case. Knowledge of interpretation ethics, knowledge of what is the role of an interpreter and those sorts of minimums, and making sure there's ways to make those available, which isn't really the role of this work group. But I just want to make sure that we're mindful of the other really less diffuse languages outside of the Spanish and indigenous languages. That being said, it sounds like there's a lot in the works to maybe make some of these trainings available to folks who do not speak English and speak Spanish for ethics and orientation. In terms of having some sort of assessment, some sort of way to assess or know that someone speaks, maybe not even the target language, but I guess you could say, do you have a Spanish proficiency test, even if we, or something like that, to make sure that relay interpretation is going to work. Is that appropriate? Say if there is a language proficiency test in one language to ask for that or hope for that, or is there something else that we can put in its place, and like maybe certain amount of interpretation experience or something like that in place of a showing of language ability? What do you guys think?
through our training curriculum, we did ask folks to do the Spanish oral proficiency exam. That was, of course, the only one available for them that was relevant to the languages they're interpreting into.
Okay.
Spanish or English, depending on their preference. I think the options that Puma laid out might be, to my knowledge, the best ones that we have in the interim as we're working on this project. I don't know, has anything else come to your mind, Puma?
I think that just workshops, workshops to be start with those workshops, small workshops with the community in the interpretation field, of course, right? To be accessible for them. That way we can keep growing and be more familiar to those terms, or
So just showing that you're participating and learning in those sorts of activities. Okay. Okay. So
I
you
also
think
wanted to echo, I think, was it Helen earlier that said the attorney should just pay the interpreter and then let the attorney fight with OPDC about getting reimbursed? Sounds like a pretty dang good solution, to be honest with you. Since it's the attorney anyway who submits it and they have to be the middle person between us and OPDC to negotiate the rates.
solution is a strong word, I think. A part of like one of the barriers I can agree with. I think that the interpreter shortage, I think, is larger than OPDC's invoicing problems. Which is why the only reason why I shared in my conversation with the presiding judge on the coast, saying that they can't get in-person Spanish court interpreters. They only get folks by phone, and they feel like it's because they can't compete with federal rates, right? And so they don't have anybody local that is certified. And so they have trouble having people travel in. So they only have folks by phone. So it's like, oh, it's not just us, because OJD's system is, for invoicing, I've heard, is preferable. And so it's not, right? It's a larger pipeline supply issue, especially in the rural parts of the state. So I hear you. And yeah, I will look more. I'm not personally familiar very much with the separation in terms of what has to be what can be attorney reimbursed versus not. I will look into it so that you at least have that knowledge in case it is helpful for your way forward. But and hopefully, I do think there have been changes since you and I started talking. Three of us started talking, Cam and Puma, whenever that was. I do think there's been changes, hopefully, in how rates are being evaluated for Indigenous languages. So hopefully the process has changed. I don't know if you guys maybe gave up on trying after previous issues you've had, so you just don't try. But I do think there's been changes to our internal process so that it's not just a automatic partial granting of what we do pay, but rather a review of what's been requested. And so that process should have changed since we had that conversation a few months ago.
Well, okay. We did just finally get approval from the request initially submitted in October, earlier this month.
I think that was one that I reviewed when we were going to talk, and so I reached out to the attorney, and we talked about how to open that request back up because we had made a change in the process, right? So I think.
Right. One thing I would flag, though, for a lengthy appointment like 2 or 3 hours, only one interpreter was approved, but it would be best practice to send multiple interpreters to take breaks during that appointment. And so, other than fighting with OPDC again, the best served publicly appointed client, we've used funds elsewhere to provide a second interpreter to attend that appointment, so that one person's not interpreting for 3 straight hours. we figured it was hard enough to get this first approval, and other than make this person go through limbo for another year.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a normally approved thing, even for lengthy appointments. Is that
I will
for
just
like a
say,
relay interpreter? I know for ASL, it's a lot more normal to have multiple folks and things like that, so that you can. Sorry, I didn't cut you off. Well,
no, I will just say it is a long-standing curse with spoken language interpreters. They have been asked to interpret lengthy things alone since the beginning of time. Research it's there. After 12 minutes, you start making errors. 12 minutes. That's all you got. And then you're asking them to do 3 hours. And so we will not even take assignments over an hour unless there's guaranteed a team. And that's because we have the benefit of privilege of growing up in the United States and knowing, you know what I mean, through my formal education about this. And again, it goes back to that thing about being paid living wage, being treated well, having an agency that can advocate for you and fight for best practices. It is not okay. That's all I will say. Like anything over an hour, and unless you can build in breaks. Like I will say, like I'll go 2 hours, but you are going to give me a 15-minute break in the middle, and that means I'm eyes shut, hands down. You cannot talk. Like everybody has to leave the room. Right. But through Gadget, like all of the research will show that. And that's off of UN best practices all the way down to the legal training. And OJD follows that too. We won't send interpreters alone for cases that are going to take anything longer than a certain amount of time. So we'll cover blocks where people are doing short, like a docket of an arraignment docket with one person, but not a full trial.
right, I do that trials, right, always have people rotating through for breaks. Because I hadn't thought about that if you're going to go do a 3 or 4 hour psych eval or something like that.
Yeah, psych eval, you definitely need to interpret just because they need to bounce
Yeah.
off each other if the interpretation is correct too, right? They
Yeah.
need to verify with each other.
And that's difficult. If they're in custody, then do they both need to be in there for the whole time? Okay, that's something to think on. It might also just be a norm to something to normalize more as the expectation that like attorneys making sure there are breaks for interpreters, right? Knowing that is a thing if interpreters are not feeling like they can advocate for that for themselves. I think I have had some times where interpreters, I feel like it was probably Adrian because I worked with him a lot, like who would say, like, I need a break. I'm like, oh, of course. As soon as you say it, I'm like, of course, we can all use a break. We've been here forever, and only in one language, the rest of us. So that could also be something that we work on is in short of being able to always provide two, making sure that that is maybe even built in, right? That could be part of the expectation that this time block includes breaks every however long, right? And if there's best practices for, every 2 hours, there's 15 minutes or something like that, then maybe that's something to consider.
I mean, if we're creating something from the ground up and like everything is like in dreamland,
right?
Right now, everything over 1 hour gets scheduled to interpreters. That's how we do it. And we do that across, I do that for anything, much less this, but then at OJD, even a matter that is 45 minutes, if it's arguments of case law, we send two because of content and density. So it's not just time, it is the nuances of what the interaction is that you might want a team as another colleague and a professional to make sure the interpretation is correct. Our pass rate for court, that test, 70% accuracy. Okay. That's all that is. Mastery level is 80%. But so there's a 30% chance of error. And when you get that team, you've got somebody to catch that, right? Like it's vital in some settings, depending on the content. So it's not just time, it's content as well. Yeah.
All right, so I put a note in here. Is best practice have multiple interpreters for longer sessions or more intensive or complicated sessions, ideally a break or change an interpreter every hour. Okay.
And I know PDC doesn't have unlimited dollars either, but that may end up pushing the max billable. Seriously, you're paying that person to be there for that time. They're giving up an appointment that they could otherwise take. And so, especially for in-person, at least what members of the collective charge for in-person, it includes their travel time and waiting to go in. And so it does double the cost. But if that's the price for language access.
Yeah.
I know it's not easy on the agency side, but that's just the reality.
Yeah. And I know you all build in the travel time into your rate so that you're not dealing with mileage and all of those things. Does it change that the policy changed that you can bill at your hourly rate for travel time? Does that change your consideration of how you developed that?
We established a 3-hour minimum for any in-person, assuming as opposed to a 2-hour minimum for a virtual, because of
to include travel,
driving, parking, going
okay.
through security,
okay,
etc. Anything beyond 3 hours is billed in hourly increments.
Right. Okay.
But to the point of folks, who would drive 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour to get somewhere to interpret for an hour and then have to go back, they get paid what, 15, 20 bucks if you're working for a language service company for 3 hours of their time, half a day, whereas they could have made just as much money in 1 hour on the phone.
Sure.
Or leaving their job and giving up their salary. Yes, anyway, there's all of that kind of baked into how the collective established its rates. I don't know if I'm missing anything, Puma. That was what I recall.
And I'll just piggyback on Cam's comment too. I mean, granted, I don't work for this organization anymore because I can't get paid. That aside, I only have a 2-hour minimum, and I never get it. And then if I do get it, it's by the wink, wink, hustle, hustle, and then I feel bad. And so, and a lot of my work is remote, and so even then, I only do 2-hour minimums because I still have to set up everything, and I'm 15 minutes early, and I'm prepping, and it's not just the time I show up. I'm doing vocabulary review. I'm checking my dictionary to make sure it's there. Like the prep that I put in is work time. I'm asking for the police report so that I can do a better job. And I'm prepping the names, the locations, the time references, all of that type of stuff.
Okay. Okay. That's helpful. All right. I think that it's hopefully helpful and a good stopping point for today. I appreciate y'all's time, and I also really love hearing how you all cross collaborate and in this space or in this time. So hopefully you all are maybe coming away with things also, and not just me tapping y'all's expertise here. I will continue to work with this. I feel like different parts of this will require different folks' input, like me trying to figure out what, if any, of the federal or other national standards might compare with OJD's, might require certain people, while, the part that we talked today, I really appreciate your time on what to do, the areas in the languages that don't have those certifications. So work in progress. Yeah.
Add to, I'm sure it's in there, but I just want to make sure that what has happened that I feel is effective with the Oregon Health Authority is when you do get an interpreter off the roster, and it's in a language that is certifiable, that has a certification and test, or the roster where they have done some language testing, the reimbursement is at a higher rate. So it incentivizes people to use people that are trained and vetted. There's not necessarily a crossover here, but that emphasis on making sure you get somebody from the list, because that's your layer of security. That's a level of insurance. You know what I mean? Like, so there's definitely two things I'm looking at. You know, it's really different when you're working with indigenous or deaf interpreters who don't have a credential that's available, or languages where there's nothing available. But when there is a language available, you must use from the list, right? Like and then once that's not available, okay, but when you create a loophole,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get warm body syndrome in there. And so, like, how do you structure something that has that security for our the population that we're serving, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, the way it's structured now is OPDC in its most recent payment policy just pegged itself to OJD. So the highest pay rate is for certified, and then there's registered, and then there's just the catch-all other, right? Not certified. So yeah, trying to think of similarly, how can we keep that where it's available, parallel, but recognizing what are other certifications that could also work that's not specifically OJDs.
yeah,
If you've been federally or other states, other things like that, like what can we pull into that? And then also what can we do to recognize and create incentive or just reduce barriers to folks that cannot access the certified tier of payment, right? Because it doesn't exist. So trying to figure out other ways to get folks, or right now a PDC, you know, whether you have to get pre-authorized or if you can just bill the agency without that also depends on your certification level, right? So trying to like keep the quality control that's trying to manage there, but also reduce barriers and make sure that there's equity and all of that and how it's managed. So
yeah, that's not an easy task. I applaud you. Thank you for doing your work.
thank you. You guys do the hard work. So I appreciate you and appreciate you giving up your time like this.
Christine, I also did want to thank you for actually listening to us, because rare occurrence, unfortunately. Also wanted to flag in your most recent email the list of requests. It seems to me there may be languages that have been incorrectly separated out because they may have been misspelled.
Very possibly. I think I noticed that. It was me last night quickly trying to see what I could pull together myself, and it's just what the attorneys might have put in their form, or I caught at least one right before I sent the email and put them together because apostrophes were different. Yeah, no, I know. Sometimes I realize someone meant a completely different language. I always try to put them on honestly Google to see if Google will tell me what is the most accepted way of I guess putting into English how to spell a native language. Yeah. So you see what we're working with here.
I was gonna say that as well. I noticed that as well, but it just makes me think as well, right? How important it has to be to work with the actually community that they have knowledge of the language, right? Because of just a misspelling, but it will erase the visibility of the actually nation of the Anjoval community, the nation of the Chuj or nation of the Quiche, right? I see 5 Anjoval there, but it's just one that 99% it's spelled well, right? But the other 4, it will, for another eyes, it could be another nation, which is just one, right? So again, the point it's what I'm trying to say, it's how important it is to work with the actually community that they have well knowledge about our language.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think it's definitely why, right, we need this group, or we need external groups to be reviewing this, because also, who knows, our own system, we might say, oh, we have an interpreter for this language, let's see what we've paid for it before, who else has done it, and because it's been spelled 5 different ways, it's just gonna create, right, just different outcomes and it's just not gonna work. So
we've seen requests for Kekchi that were for Quiche, or Chuk that were for Chukis. So yeah, just to Puma's point.
Wait, did you say chook and chookies, or are you saying a different?
We've received requests that were they asked for chuk, Maya chuk,
Okay,
but they
okay,
really
okay.
needed chukis
Okay, okay,
from a different continent.
okay.
So just to underline Puma's point.
No, you suddenly made me worried that like CHUK chook and chukis were also somehow different within a same family of languages, and I was like, have I just been messing that up too? Okay, all right.
So,
Now I hear you.
chuk. Yeah.
Now I hear. Okay, I understand now. Yeah, I could definitely see people making that mistake. Fortunately, all right. Thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate you guys just being able to talk and educate and work through this. Probably for the millionth time as you try to get towards where you guys are trying to go. So I very much appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.